When we imagine the dawn of humanity, we picture thunder, claw marks and shadows at the edge of firelight. Yet the harshest hunter was not a beast but the world itself. Hunger, cold, thirst, and distance pressed against every breath. This story begins with a small band on the wind-cut plains of southern Africa, feet aching, ribs sore, eyes tracking clouds for mercy. Lightning stitched the horizon. Rain hammered the grass. In a limestone bluff they found a narrow hollow, dry, dark, and smelling of stone. They entered not bravely, but because there was nowhere else to go. Inside, echoes braided with the hiss of rain. A few embers glowed, nursed from roots carried all day. Smoke thinned toward the mouth. If you're listening while falling asleep, settle into their quiet. The soft shuffle of bodies, the scrape of a flake on bone, the humid scent of wet dust and skin. Outside, predators paced and gave up. Inside, breath steadied, hearts slowed. The cave did not promise safety. It offered time to heal, to think, to notice one another. In that pause, fear loosened its grip and a first idea formed without words. We can return here, again and again. Morning arrived, thin and pale, pouring through the entrance like a slow river of light. The storm was gone. The world smelled rinsed and new. Warmth clung to the rock where bodies had slept, and the floor held prints like small maps of the night. Fingers brushed the walls, chalking lines in ash, accidentally marking that they had been. A child coughed and laughed. An elder listened for movement beyond the mouth, hearing only birds testing the air. They chewed marrow and shared water cupped in palms. One by one they stepped to the threshold and studied distance. Tracks in soft mud, fallen branches, a broken nest. They would hunt, gather and carry fire, but now the day had an anchor. The cave was no longer a stop between dangers. It had shape, scent, and memory. Its ceiling could hold smoke. Its ledges could cradle tools. Its corners could keep dreams from the wind. The group spoke in gestures and murmurs, passing meaning hand to hand. They did not name it home, yet their bodies understood. When they left, someone arranged stones by the entrance. A quiet promise to return, a simple boundary against night. The path remembered them back. Fire didn't begin in the cave. It came with them, cradled in bark, fed with dried grass, carried like breath from place to place. But within stone walls, fire changed shape. It stopped being a flicker in the wind and became a presence. Inside the cave, flames didn't scatter. They bounced and curled, painting the ceiling with colour, making even the roughest wall seem warm. The fire crackled beside them as they slept, as they whispered, as they sharpened bone into hooks and flint into knives. Children stared into the coals, not knowing that what they were watching would reshape their world. The night outside was thick with movement, eyes, teeth, the rustle of clawed feet in the brush. But the cave held the fire, and the fire held them. Light became rhythm, sparks marked time, shadows turned into shapes that could be read, remembered. Here they could eat without being eaten. They could plan beyond the next sunrise. They began to dream beside fire and dream differently, not of escape, but of staying. For the first time, warmth had walls, and within that warmth, ideas began to stretch beyond instinct, toward safety, toward pattern, toward story. By day, the fire was quieter, reduced to coal and ash, but its memory stayed on every surface. Walls were streaked black with soot. Stone bowls were warm to the touch. Wood had curled and hardened from heat, shaping tools better suited to grip and strike. They experimented with placement, near the wall for wind, near the centre for warmth, never too close to sleep. The older ones taught where to lay stones to keep sparks from catching hair or fur. Over time, a rhythm formed. One person watched the flames, one gathered fuel, another prepared food, and someone else guarded the entrance. These weren't laws, only learned repetitions, and still, the fire changed them. The stories told by gesture and breath became clearer in the flicker. A child's cry turned into song. Marks scratched near the pit may have meant nothing, or they may have been the first attempts to hold a memory in place. Ash drifted across the floor and clung to their skin. They didn't know it yet, but the fire had become part of them, carried not only in ember and bark, but in thought, repetition, and the will to remain. Before language, before song, There was the sound of stone meeting stone. The first tools weren't invented in a moment of inspiration. They were shaped through repetition, failure, and the quiet patience of observation. In the cave, these tools began to stay. Flakes of quartz, bone awls, and ochre-stained grindstones remained even after people moved on. At Blombos Cave, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of these traces. Bone points sharp enough to pierce hide, stone flakes curved just right to scrape fat from skin. These were not random. They followed patterns. A learned hand had shaped them. These objects held intention, and that intention began to live outside the body. A boy might pick up the tool his grandmother shaped seasons ago and continue its purpose. A woman might repair a blade her child dulled. In this way, the cave remembered. Tools were not just for cutting or killing. They were extensions of memory, of community. Every mark on a stone, every dent on a bone was a conversation without words. They were the first things we made that could outlive us, and so they mattered differently. In these tools, early humans found something lasting, a way to belong to time, not just to the moment. Making was slow. There was no rush in a world that moved with weather and hunger. A bone needle might take hours to scrape, polish, and pierce. Ochre had to be collected from specific cliffs, then ground on flat rock with care. The powder it produced stained fingertips and hide alike. Some was likely used for tanning, some for marking bodies, and some for reasons we still don't fully understand. But whatever the use, the act of making was shared. People watched, copied, corrected. They sat close, handed tools from one to another, learned by seeing. This was the beginning of teaching. In these moments, the cave became more than shelter. It became a place where skills were passed down. Tools became stories. A sharpened point carried not just function, but the shape of the hand that made it. And when someone died, their tools might remain, kept, used, even buried. In that choice, we see something new. Not survival, but care. They were no longer just surviving the world. They were shaping it. And in shaping it together, they were slowly shaping one another. The cave did more than hold bodies and fire. Over time, it began to hold ideas. On the stone walls of Blombos Cave, researchers found ochre pieces engraved with cross-hatched lines. Simple, deliberate, repeating. These were not accidental scratches. They were marks made with purpose, etched deep enough to last tens of thousands of years. No one can say exactly what they meant, but they meant something. And that something, pattern, memory, identity, turned survival into expression. To draw a line was to say I was here. To repeat it was to suggest I belong. Long before writing, before symbols had sound, the first artists used red earth and stone edges to leave traces of thought. Some may have marked tools, others may have painted their bodies. Perhaps the cave itself became canvas. Surfaces once blank were gradually layered with ochre dust, handprints, and shallow engravings. These were not decorations. They were continuity. They linked one season to the next, one person to another. In this way, art began not with beauty, but with memory. In every carved mark, early humans tested a new truth, that life could echo beyond the moment, that survival could be seen, not just endured. Art was not separate from life. It came from the same hands that carved tools and built fires. The same fingers that pressed meat from bone also pressed pigment onto stone. Around the hearth, someone may have traced the outline of a hand in ochre, then added another beside it. These marks may have been teaching tools, clan signs, or a kind of counting. Or maybe they were something quieter, a way to speak without words. Some marks were simple scratches, others were more complex, appearing again and again in different sites, across great distances. That repetition matters. It means the knowledge moved. People watched, remembered, and carried the patterns to new places. A shape drawn on one cave wall might appear again, thousands of miles away, generations later. This wasn't coincidence, it was communication. And in that passing of form we see the beginning of something profoundly human. Culture. The cave was not just a shelter, it was a transmitter. A surface for language not yet spoken aloud. A gallery of survival. And in its quiet dark, early humans learned that their thoughts could live outside of them, scratched into stone and left behind for others to find. While early Homo sapiens left ochre marks in southern Africa, another human lineage lived far to the north. in the cold, high-altitude caves of Central Asia. We call them Denisovans, named after Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. They left behind no known art, no carved symbols, only fragments, a tooth, part of a finger bone, and traces of DNA in the dust. But those traces tell a remarkable story. Denisovans were not simply cousins to us. They lived parallel lives. They shaped tools, built hearths, hunted game, and survived in some of the most extreme environments on Earth. In Denisova Cave, archaeologists found ornaments made from polished green stone and drilled animal teeth, objects that required skill and intention. These people understood materials. They understood fire, and they likely understood each other in ways we'll never fully know. Their children left no direct language behind, but their genes live on in people from Asia and Oceania. Denisovans were not ghosts, they were neighbours, distant, quiet, and resourceful. While Homo sapiens were learning to paint with ochre, Denisovans were learning to endure cold, height, and isolation. Two kinds of humans, two paths through the same age of survival. For a long time it was believed that Homo sapiens had emerged alone into the world, unique and untouched by others. But the caves tell a different story, one of overlap. In some regions, Homo sapiens and Denisovans likely met. They may have traded tools, food, or fire. They may have spoken in signs or gestures. They may have fought or shared shelter. We don't know. What we do know is this: their DNA exists within us. That means they didn't vanish completely. They became part of the human story. Denisovans may have mastered high mountain living in ways we still struggle to understand. At 3,000 meters above sea level, air thins. Cold becomes constant, and yet they survived. Their bones show strength, their tools show precision, and their survival shows quiet genius. They didn't leave cave art, but they left presence. And in the silence of Denisova Cave, among layers of sediment and stone, we find proof that humans were never alone in becoming what we are. We were shaped not just by the earth but by each other. Survival meant movement, but it also meant rhythm. The days of early humans followed the path of hunger. They rose with the sun and walked long distances, searching for tracks in soft earth, cracked seed shells near trees, or the flicker of movement in the brush. Hunting was not a guaranteed success. Sometimes they followed hoofprints for hours, only to return with empty hands. Other days, a bird's cry or a trail of a scat led them to antelope, small game, or porcupine. Spears were tipped with fire-hardened points, and traps were set in patterns learned over time. Children watched, not just to learn but to participate. A well-thrown stone was a skill worth praising. Even in failure, the group adapted. Roots were dug from dry soil, shellfish pried from rocks, every edible piece mattered. Around the fire, meals were shared without counting. There was no feast without the group, and in this sharing, bonds were reinforced. The fire was not just for warmth or light, it was where knowledge passed hands. Who to follow, when to run, how to find the animal's trail again. In that simple loop, hunger, search, return, rest. The foundations of human community were quietly laid. The hearth marked the return. Even without a fixed dwelling, early humans knew the value of a shared centre. The fire's glow in the cave meant survival, but also belonging. Food was prepared slowly with muscle and memory. Marrow was scooped from cracked bones using tools of stone or horn. Meat roasted over wood that had been carefully selected to burn hot and clean. The scent filled the cave and stayed on skin and clothing for days. Children learned what bark smoked too much, what root added flavour, which bone made the best handle. Everyone had a role, to bring wood, to tend flame, to watch the walls for dripping water or signs of weakness. Even silence had purpose. It allowed the fire to speak, to crackle, to shift, to warn. And within that space, as eyes grew heavy and stories formed in gesture and breath, they became more than a hunting party. They became something older than tribe, older than family. They became a group shaped by the same hunger, warmed by the same flame. In every flicker of firelight there was memory, not just of the day's hunt, but of the need to face the world together. The world did not stay still. Rains shifted, winds turned, herds that once passed the cave vanished over the horizon. With them went the rhythm early humans had relied on. The dry season lasted longer. Waterholes shrank. Thornbrush thickened in the heat. Then came sudden cold, winds that swept down from the interior, flattening grass and chilling the bone. The cave, once a place of return, became a refuge from more than predators. It was now shelter from a changing earth. There were nights when the fire could not be kept alive, when the last embers hissed into darkness and the cold sank into skin. In those times, silence filled the cave, broken only by breathing and the shifting of bodies huddled close. Children shivered beneath shared hides. Elders stared toward the mouth, waiting for light to return. Yet even in these moments the group endured. Fire would return. They had done it before. They would do it again. Each season tested them in new ways, but every time they rebuilt the fire, gathered fuel, found food, or learned a new path, they were no longer just surviving, they were adapting. With every hardship, their understanding of the land deepened. Not all dangers came from the sky or the cold. Sometimes the wind carried unfamiliar scents of other humans. Some were distant groups following the same herds. Others came closer. A sharp whistle in the dark, a footprint too fresh. In those moments, the cave became a boundary, not just shelter. They reinforced the entrance with stacked stones, kept fire low, and listened. The line between hunter and hunted blurred, but this too became part of their knowledge. They learned where to move, when to stay hidden, how to read the trails of others as they did animals. Fear taught them to change. It taught them to prepare, to gather more than they needed, to keep embers hidden under ash, to travel at dusk and leave no prints. These choices shaped their lives. The fire was no longer just warmth. It was a signal, a risk, a promise. And so, fear became part of their rhythm. It did not stop them. It shaped them. And in shaping them, it pushed them towards something new. Awareness, memory, and the earliest edge of strategy. They were learning not just to survive nature, but to survive each other. Time moved differently in the cave. It wasn't measured in minutes or hours, but in the quiet layering of use. Ash from last season still marked the corners. Bone fragments lay where marrow had once been scooped. A piece of shell, pierced and forgotten, glinted faintly near the wall. Every return added something. Every absence left room for something to settle. These spaces, Blombos Cave, Sibudu, and others, were not just shelters, but archives. The earth held their passing. Sediment packed over decades recorded fires, footsteps, and even breath. The soot on the ceiling remembered every flame. A flake of ochre marked where someone once sat and ground pigment in the same rhythm as those before. Children were born and raised here. Some died here. Their remains, curled beneath rock ledges or tucked near hearths, were buried with care. No monuments were needed. The cave itself became a record. Not in words or carvings, but in layers of earth, each one a story without voice. To return to the same shelter over generations was not simply convenience, it was connection. The cave grew familiar, not just in structure, but in spirit. In a world without maps, it was the closest thing to place. Even long after a group moved on, the cave kept their presence. A discarded tool, a woven mat left to rot, a bit of twine snagged on a stone. These things remained. When others came, they noticed. They saw the marks, the hearth, the arrangement of stones, and whether they stayed a day or a season, they added their own. Caves became layered with human presence, sometimes over thousands of years. Some were visited and revisited until the very walls became thick with memory. In Blombos, beads made from Nasarius shells still bear wear marks where string once passed. In other caves, sharpened bone points lie beside ashes from hundreds of fires. Each object, each trace carried meaning. Not grand, not ceremonial, just real. The memory of those who came before was not always sacred. Sometimes it was simply useful. A place that worked once might work again. But in that usefulness, a thread formed. And over time, the cave was no longer just a hiding place or workshop. It was a container for the ordinary, the lost, the remembered. The longer people returned, the more the cave changed them. And the more they stayed, the more they shaped the cave in return. Something changed in the cave. Not in the walls or the fire, but in the people. At some point, thought stretched beyond the moment. Not just how to make a tool, but why certain shapes felt right. Not only how to survive the night, but how to prepare for a season not yet begun. This was not instinct. It was reflection. The cave, with its quiet repetition and layered memory, gave space for something new, imagination. Perhaps it began beside the fire, where shadows danced and flickered like animals on the hunt. Children watched, then copied the forms with their hands. Perhaps it began with mourning, recognizing absence, placing stones where someone once slept. These were not grand inventions, but subtle shifts in awareness, to notice pattern, to expect, to remember, and to imagine. The minds of early humans were no longer just responding, they were anticipating. They began to map not just space, but time, knowing where to find roots in a certain month, returning to caves when the rains came, leaving markers behind. These were the roots of knowledge, not passed as words, but shown, repeated and absorbed. Thought no longer lived only in the body. It had begun to live in the group. Gesture became memory. Memory became signal. Over time, humans began to speak, not just with hands and faces, but with sound. Perhaps not sentences, but rhythm, repetition, shared meaning, a warning call, a call to gather, a pattern of clicks or hums passed between generations. Language as we know it was still distant, but its bones were forming. The cave helped this happen. Its stillness made sound stand out. Its walls reflected voices back, teaching how tone could rise and fall. Around the fire, symbols became motions, motions became mimicry, mimicry became meaning. In those moments, communication expanded. A shape drawn in ash meant hunt. A rhythm tapped on stone meant danger. Slowly, these meanings held. They lasted. And because they lasted, people could plan. They could share. They could dream aloud. Fire, stone, hunger, memory, all of it merged into thought that could move from one body to another. This was not survival alone. It was the beginning of consciousness shaped by company. The cave, once only shelter, had become the first classroom, the first cradle of language, the first place the human mind saw itself. They did not call it a home. There was no word, no label carved into stone, but their actions spoke louder than language. They returned. Again and again, season after season, generation after generation. Each time they stepped back through the narrow mouth of the cave, they brought stories with them, of hunts, of hunger, of loss and survival. And each time they left something behind, a broken blade, a carved shell, a stain of ash where the fire had once lived. In these small deposits, they were building something invisible but powerful, memory rooted in place. For early humans, the cave was not permanent, but it was faithful. It waited when they wandered. It held their warmth in its stone. It knew the shape of their fire. They trusted it to catch their breath when the world grew sharp. Over time, these shelters gained meaning that went beyond survival. They became the places where people were born, where they died, where they rested and taught and dreamed. And though the walls could not speak, they echoed with the quiet certainty of return. The cave did not change the world, but it helped shape the people who eventually would. What began as refuge became reflection. The cave shaped how early humans thought, gathered, and grew. It was dark, but it taught them to use light. It was still, but it taught them movement. It held silence, but gave rise to rhythm, repetition, and perhaps, eventually, language. Fire carved its shadows. Tools were sharpened in its corners. Children were named, though their names are lost to time. Still, the echoes remain, in the soot that clings to ceilings, in the shells drilled by hand, in the bones tucked beneath smooth ledges. These are the first places where the human story settled, not forever, but long enough to matter. Even now, when we enter a cave and feel the shift in air, the hush, the weight of stone, we are stepping into something ancient, something remembered. These caves are not just archaeology, they are memory made solid. And though the world outside has changed beyond recognition, their quiet stillness reminds us where we began. In the dark, we lit a flame. In the silence, we listened. And in the shelter of stone, we became something more than survival. We became human. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.